Hello,
All right.
everyone. Welcome to the Wild and Scenic Film Festival. This is the filmmaker Q&A for Entangled. My name is Cody Wasuda, and I'm here with David Abel. It's my pleasure to welcome David. He's a renowned journalist from the Boston Globe and award-winning filmmaker. David produced and directed Entangled, and his journalism has taken him all around the world, from the Tierra del Fuego to the melting Arctic Sea. David became a fellow of the Nieman Foundation at Harvard University from 2012 to 2013 and was selected for the Knight Chair of Journalism in 2016. He is also host of the podcast Climate Rising, produced by Harvard Business School. David, the Wild and Scenic Film Festival is lucky to have you with us this evening. How you doing?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you.
Yeah, well, Entangled was quite the film. I'm sure that was an experience producing that. The first question I want to ask you is, where are we now since filming ended and you produced and released the film? Can you get us up to date with the state of the right whales?
Sure. So there have been a lot of developments. First, I want to just thank Wild and Scenic for featuring our film. It's so nice to be able to share our film, a film of ours again, with your audience. One of our last films, Sacred Cod, was screened a few years ago at Wild and Scenic, and we had so much fun in Nevada City, and just wish we could be there with you all now. But back to the film. So this was actually a really difficult film to end. As we were trying to put the final touches on the film, there are all these developments, and the goalpost, in a sense, kind of kept moving. And so we had to change the end of the film a number of times, so much that actually just a week ago, we refined a few things in the film. So everyone who has or will watch the film will see the latest version of the film. I think we're finally done with it, but who knows? But to put a few markers on what's changed in the last few months. So number one, the population of right whales has continued to decline. So last fall, scientists estimated there were probably, they kind of throw out a specific number, but more or less they thought there were roughly 411 North Atlantic right whales, and their population had plummeted from 2010 to nearly 500. They were seen as somewhat of a success story because their numbers had actually grown since the 1980s, when there were believed to only be about 300 or so left. And there's a whole sort of backstory about the history and how whaling decimated their populations. But between last year's estimate and a few weeks ago, the most recent estimate was that there are 356 right whales left. And that was a dire estimate for a population that only has roughly about 85 breeding females. And when you lose breeding females, you basically get to functional extinction. And over the course of the last 6 months, since we basically completed the film, we have seen the International Conservation of Nature, I think it's called, the International Union of Conservation Nature, which has this red list of endangered species, just upgraded the right whale to something called endangered in the wild, I think is the classification. I might be screwing that up, but to make a long story short, that's one step away from extinction. And also in the last few months, which we account for in the film, 2 federal courts have ruled against the primary government regulator, the National Marine Fisheries Service, saying that they were violating the Endangered Species Act by failing to do enough to reduce the primary cause of death of these whales, and that is entanglement in fishing gear. And most recently, which is not accounted for really. Well, I guess we did. No, we did account for this in the latest version of the film, which is actually the primary reason why we updated it. The federal government, after about 2 years of promising to take action and not taking action, when the mortalities have spiked in the last few years, they finally introduced a series of rules that would adopt much of the proposals that were made almost 2 years ago, which we chronicle in the film, to try to reduce the amount of these things called vertical buoy lines, that the lines that stretch from the surface of the ocean to the bottom of the ocean, that make it easier for lobstermen to pick up their traps from the bottom of the sea. The federal government just announced rules that would effectively reduce those lines, and also, as we were talking about before this, the state of Massachusetts, where I live, just announced a plan that would effectively ban lobster fishing in all waters off Massachusetts for several months a year, the primary periods when right whales are here. So those are a series of developments that have just taken place in the last few weeks and months.
Wow. 4 months a year is, that's a significant amount of time for anyone to have to be out of work. So I've got one great question coming in here for you from the audience. What are some of the challenges that you experience while filming controversial or heated issues?
Well, there are all kinds of challenges when you're trying to tell a story that has a lot of passionate people behind it. So I would say, as a journalist, you often find yourself knocking on doors and people not answering, or being unwilling to speak, or not returning your calls, or not being interested in participating in the story that you're writing or the film you're making. With this film, I have to say I was incredibly fortunate that was not the case. And with one notable exception, just about everyone we wanted to speak to was willing to talk to us and welcome us into their worlds, from fishermen to scientists to regulators to environmental advocates. And so we were fortunate to have tremendous access to make this film. So that was the perk. The challenge, I guess, is that some people, especially those with economic interests at stake, certain groups in Maine that were really opposed to this, were not willing to talk to us, and we would have liked to have more from them, but we had to, go about telling their side of the story in other ways. So that's what we did.
Yeah, and we see a lot of that in the film, the rallies in Maine and that sort of thing. Yeah. Have you received criticism for making this film?
I usually view criticism as a sort of badge of honor, and I'm a little skeptical when people are too too happy with a piece of filmmaking or journalism. You hope to have somewhat sharp elbows and rustle a little bit. But I have to say, I think we have been, with some exceptions, really we've really received a lot of wonderful feedback from all sides of the story. There are a few people in Maine that haven't really patted us on the back, that weren't too happy, because the film does look critically at certain groups in Maine who have been fighting regulations to protect the whales. But what we really tried to do here, and what we've done in our previous films, whether it was the film about the collapse of the cod fishery. So this film in some ways is sort of the capstone of a trilogy of films we've made about how climate change is affecting our world. And in these last three films, it has looked at how climate change is affecting the body of water off of New England called the Gulf of Maine. And we've spent a lot of time looking at that because the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than almost any other body of water on the planet for a variety of different reasons. And it has had dramatic impacts on iconic species, from the cod, which is this once incredibly abundant species that attracted settlers from Europe. The Pilgrims came here to fish cod, and arguably the warming of the waters has caused a collapse in the cod fishery. And then the next film we made, called Lobster War, was about how the warming actually caused the lobster catch in certain parts of the Gulf of Maine to actually boom. And as a result of that surge in the lobster catch, there was this long dormant conflict that dates back to the end of the Revolutionary War over this small island between Nova Scotia and down East Maine, that nobody really cared about for centuries, until suddenly the waters around them, which both countries claim, suddenly became flush with lobster. And as a result, the Canadians, who long ceded those waters to the Americans, said, hey, those are our waters too, and we're going to fish them. And that ignited all kinds of conflict and some violence. And so, and that's why we call it Lobster War. And while making that film, I learned a lot about the conflicts between the lobster industry and this which is the most valuable fishery in North America, and one of the most endangered species on the planet, the North Atlantic right whale. And while learning about this, I also learned about how climate change was playing a role and having a serious impact on the trajectory of the species, because their primary food source has declined in much of their feeding grounds here in the Gulf of Maine by as much as 90%. And as a result of that decline in their food source, they've had to go to places where they'd never been seen before. And as a result, there were no regulations, and we've seen lots of whales die either by being caught in fishing gear or by being hit by vessels.
So for those of you watching who are wondering about, the first film is called Sacred Cod, right?
That's right.
And the second one is Lobster Wars. Okay. So, you bring up a really interesting point, right? That these whales migrate, right? So they're crossing international borders all the time. How difficult is the management that goes on between Canada and New England? There was a large focus in the film about those whales that died in the Strait of St. Lawrence, and I think I have that correct.
The Gulf of St. Lawrence.
Gulf of St. Lawrence, excuse me. And when those issues come up, did you notice that Canada and the United States came together and say, hey, we need to solve this problem, or is there a lot more finger pointing going on?
Well, there's both. So there's a lot of tension here. So we, over the last 2 years, have been going through this effort, which is what the film chronicles, this effort to try to reduce mortalities and serious injuries of the right whales. And the film chronicles this effort to try to reduce the number of lobster lines in the Gulf of Maine by roughly half. But one of the main arguments that fishermen, the lobstermen in Maine, have been making is, hey, this isn't our fault. Why are you forcing us to make these changes when most of the deaths in the last few years have been in Canadian waters, which is true. The problem is that we don't know every whale that dies, and we do know for years a lot of whales have died as a result of entanglements in our waters as well. And we also know that the whales are not just killed by entanglements in fishing gear, they're also highly stressed and harmed in other ways. And scientists have estimated that at least 85% of the remaining 350 or 400 right whales have been entangled at least once in fishing gear. And of those, something like 60% have been entangled twice. And scientists say that the stress of entanglements, if it doesn't kill the whales, especially females, can make it causes them to burn a lot of energy, dragging often heavy traps, or sometimes it wraps around their mouth so that they can't really feed. Mm-hmm. And it makes it very difficult for them to reproduce. Mm-hmm. And in 2018, for the first time since these whales have been studied, there were 0 births. And that was considered catastrophic, even more than the number of deaths. And we've had a substantial decline in births in recent years, which scientists attribute to the increased stress from entanglements.
Wow. Yeah, that fact coming out in the movie about no births that's pretty devastating to hear.
Right.
Looking forward, what, if any, legislation would you like to see passed by the Biden administration concerning this issue?
Well, I think it's not really legislation that's needed. I mean, the first thing is that, there have been all kinds of efforts to try to reduce the reach or the kill various provisions of the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So I think the first thing is to ensure that those changes don't happen. I think we will not see any serious effects now that the Democrats have a unified control of the government, at least for now. But I think it's more of a regulatory issue than a legislative issue. Right. But there are things that there are legislative potential approaches. There is something called the Save the Right Whale Act, which would provide a lot of money to research and also invest in a potential way to solve this problem. And might as well talk about that now. So unlike a lot of problems in this world, where there are intractable, very difficult to solve problems, this one isn't. We know that since 2010, all known deaths, whenever there's been a cause of death determined, the reason has been us for right whales. Mm-hmm. And all of those right whales, actually with one exception now, that is the first calf to be born this year, died just after being born and is believed to have been stillborn, sadly. But so that's the only known right whale to have died naturally. So we know we need to do 2 things to essentially protect the species. The first is to try to reduce the amount of vertical lines in the water or mm-hmm. eliminate them. Mm-hmm. And second, try to reduce the number of ships that strike the whales. And there are various ways to do that. And what a lot of folks here have called for, and which seems like a increasingly potentially possible solution to this major problem, the primary cause of their death, entanglements, is to use something called ropeless fishing gear. And what that involves, which we address a bit in the film, is new technology that allows you to raise lobster traps from the bottom of the ocean without lines, without rope. And there's now all kinds of different competing technologies that allow a fisherman to essentially press a button on an app on their phone that would cause a lift bag to inflate at the bottom of the ocean and raise up a bunch of traps. And the technology has been proven that it works. But there are problems like, it's still in a formative state. Fishermen aren't comfortable with it. And mostly at this point, it's too expensive. And so the hope is that the technology over time will be refined and that the federal government will eventually help subsidize a transition of the fishery from rope to ropeless, and that would hopefully reduce unnatural mortalities of right whales substantially.
You went into my next question, which is great. The ropeless systems are super exciting. Like, all right, that doesn't work. Who's got the best idea? Let's find out. And it was exciting to see you cover that in the film. And yeah, the question is, are they viable? Or is there a way that you can make a ropelessly fished lobster attractive to the consumer public, right? Like, is that something that we've seen? Or how, the next question that pops into mind is like, well, how many fishermen, what percentage of fishermen are actually using them at this time? Because the issue, right, is like, we're dealing with this really tiny window as you outlined in the film, and waiting for this technology to become cheap enough to use doesn't seem like an option.
Right. And so right now, actually, at the moment, it's technically illegal to fish with this ropeless gear here.
Wait, really?
And it's technically illegal because fishermen have to get a license, mm-hmm. and the license only allows you to fish in specific ways. Mm-hmm. There is the latest federal regulations allow a certain amount of experimentation in certain areas where there are going to be new closures to protect the whales. Mm-hmm. So we might see changes, and this is certainly something, this is the sort of next step of the regulatory process as more of these technologies become reach a state where they show that they are safe and that they work, mm-hmm. And that they're not going to sort of be left on the bottom of the ocean. Mm-hmm. The hope is that the states and the federal government will legalize this, and that seems to be where we're heading. The real question now is proving the technology, which testing is certainly legal, but actually fishing with it is the next step, and we're likely to see that in the coming few year or two, hopefully.
That sounds like the fourth part of your trilogy, really. That would be pretty interesting. Let's go back to NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service. Is it your opinion that they were working too slowly on this issue, or in your eyes, what do you think they need to do?
Well, going back to one of your earlier questions about the challenges of making this film, so there are incredibly, powerful interest groups and vocal interest groups on different sides here. And so NOAA, the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is a part of NOAA, has been caught in this tough spot for many years. And fishermen tend to get have more political power than others because they have money and they have the most to lose, and their constituency that is often represented by a bipartisan group of public officials. So here, in New England, if you, no matter which side of the aisle you're on, whether it's Senator Elizabeth Warren or Senator Susan Collins, they're all looking to speak for the fishermen, and they don't want to piss off the fishermen. And so they have successfully, for many years, made it very difficult for the agency to proceed with any substantial regulations that could that could harm their bottom line. And these new regulations came about as a result of lawsuits and consistent, repeated pressure and an acknowledgement of the facts, which are that this population has declined by 25% in just the past decade, and that has made the potential extinction of this species of it would be the first great whale to go extinct in modern history. It has been incontrovertible that this whale is in serious decline, and so those facts and pressure from environmental groups through lawsuits have forced the government to act. And so now this agency, which has this very conflicted mission of trying to, number one, promote thriving commercial fisheries, and two, protect endangered species, walk a very fine line to try to do both.
Yeah, almost an impossible task.
Right. Right. Hopefully not impossible, though. And arguably, these new regulations that are now in this comment period that were just finally released after nearly a year of being in a regulatory black hole, arguably because they were the Trump administration has been sitting on these rules and didn't want to upset a potential constituency that would vote for Donald Trump. And they actually succeeded because Donald Trump actually got some electoral votes in Maine in the areas where the fishermen live. And they sat on these regulations and didn't act, mainly, I would say, to avoid losing a few electoral votes that could have been very important in a tight election.
Okay, David, I have one final question for you. We're pretty much at our limit here. Someone who just viewed the film, who got to enjoy it during the Wild and Scenic Film Festival, what is something that they can do to help influence the current state of right whales? How can they take action?
Well, to start off with a self-serving answer, they should tell people about this film.
Okay.
And share tell people, the more people who watch this film, and they can learn more about it at entangled-film.com. And they will hopefully, the more people who learn about the plight of the whales, the more people will take action to try to protect them and also find reasonable solutions that accommodate what is an incredibly important part of our economy here, the lobster fishery. But at the same time, they can, talk to their lawmakers about doing the right thing, which is trying to protect our biodiversity and, iconic species that are part of a growing, number of species. One of the reasons I made this film was because I learned about a year and a half ago through a report by the United Nations that we are on target because of climate change to lose as much as 1 million species by the end of this century, and that is just a really overwhelming and daunting statistic. And I thought, we have to sort of convey that, but number is so hard for anybody to comprehend. And I thought maybe if we could tell that story through one species, one iconic species like the right whale, it might resonate with people. And so, this is part of our heritage and part of our world here, particularly in New England. It would be pretty awful to lose the right whale. So hopefully people will see the wisdom of trying to do more to protect our planet's biodiversity.
It's a beautiful idea, David. Yeah, capturing it with the right whale. And I think you did it wonderfully in your movie. So everybody, you heard it here. Tell everyone about the Entangled movie. Talk to your local legislators, talk to your lawmakers, and let's save this thing. Thank you, David.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
Nice chat.